Have you ever wondered how far a person can stand before something breaks inside? That feeling of when someone takes so much from you that there is only a huge void. Today I will tell a story that few people know, but it shows how human strength comes in the most unlikely places. A woman who endured the unbearable until the moment she decided that no more day would pass without justice. What would you do if you were in her place? This is not just a story of revenge. It is a portrait of the human soul in its darker and bright moments. If you appreciate real stories that challenge what we think about courage, don't miss a second of this account. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any of these hidden stories from our history, and get ready to know a face of American slavery that books do not show. What Sarah did on that day of 1858 would change her life forever, but everyone around her. The Willowbrook plantation rose like a pale ghost under the inclemented sun of South Carolina. The ruins of the big house still kept, among the deteriorated walls, the scream echoes that time could not silence. The smell of wet earth mixed with the aroma of the profusion jasmine, contrasting the natural beauty with the cruelty that had once defined that place. It is said that at night, when the moon touches the broken windows, it is still possible to hear the floor of the floor, as if someone walked around, carrying the weight of a story that refuses to die. In that property, as in so many others from South America before the Civil War, the line between humanity and property was defined by skin color. Men, women, and children transformed into work tools, into numbers in an accounting book, in bodies without even having their own stories. But there is a truth that remains a scar in American memory. When it denies the humanity of someone for a long time, this humanity finds ways of manifesting itself that shake the structures of the system itself that tried to destroy it. If you want to follow more cases like this which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. Willowbrook stretched 326 acres of fertile land, where cotton grew in abundance under the work of 47 slaves. The big house, an imposing two-story building with 6 front columns and a porch surrounding the entire perimeter, housed the Blackwood family, Patriarch Samuel, his wife Margaret, and his 3 children. The senzala was 200 meters from the main house, a set of 12 ceiling wooden cabins without windows, where the air became almost breathable in the summer. Between the big house and the senzala, the trunk of punishment was made of aged and stained wood, a silent witness to the punishments applied almost daily. The day began at 4 a.m. with the sound of the bell that echoed for the property. The slaves had 15 minutes to leave their huts and line up for the distribution of tasks. The journey stretched to the sunset, with only a brief noon to noon for a precarious meal. A loaf of cornbread and, with luck, some salted meat remains. The overseer, John Miller, circulated through the fields mounted on his black horse, the whip always by hand, ready to punish any sign of rest or slowness. At night, exhausted, slaves still needed to take care of additional tasks, repair tools, weave baskets, prepare the food the next day. Sleep, when it came, was interrupted by nightmares, the crying of the children, the moan of the sick and injured. In the air, the smells of sweat, the damp land, cotton, the food being prepared in the outer kitchens were mixed. The sounds formed a cruel symphony, the crack of the whip, the shouted orders, the low corners that helped mark the rhythm of the work, the muffled cry, the gate ranger, the wind between the trees. And about all this, he hovered a constant feeling, a shared knowledge. In that place, something terrible germinated, growing quietly as the roots of the trees that witnessed impassive, everyday horror. Amid this scenario of degradation, Sarah Johnson stood out not only for her beauty, dark and bright skin like polished ebony, almond eyes of a deep brown, a strong body shaped by constant work, but mainly for her extraordinary ability with medicinal herbs. At 28, Sarah knew every plant that grew around the plantation and knew how to extract medicine for almost every evil. This ability, inherited from his grandmother, a healer brought from West Africa, guaranteed her a peculiar position. Although enslaved, she was traveling between 2 worlds. In the senzala, it was respected by his knowledge that relieved pain, he healed wounds, facilitated deliveries. In the big house, it was requested whenever conventional medicines failed to treat the Blackwood family diseases. Sarah had learned to read secretly, observing the classes of Mr. Blackwood's children through the window while waiting to serve the tea. He memorized each letter, every word, and practiced drawing on the damp earth with a twig when no one watched. This forbidden knowledge allowed him to decipher the labels of imported medicines, discreetly consult the medical book held in the library of the big house, expand his own medicinal knowledge. In the enslaved community, Sarah was more than a healer. It was a symbol of silent resistance. When she prepared her medicine at night, in the small cabin she shared with 3 other women, she told Africa stories that her grandmother had transmitted her, keeping the memory of a place where people were, not properties, were alive. He kept, hidden under a loose floorboard, a small bag of cloth containing seeds of rare medicinal plants, a carved wood amulet, and a piece of red fabric treasures of his lineage, connecting it to a past beyond the captivity. What no one suspected was that, along with the drugs they healed, Sarah also knew the plants they could kill, fall asleep, cause pain or hallucinations. A silence, kept knowledge, like a weapon I had never thought of using, until events took a course that would turn that skilled and compassionate woman into something no one could predict. Leave in the comments. Never give up the truth if you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. The hell in Willowbrook had gradations. There was the work in the fields, exhausting and relentless, under the sun that burned the skin and drying the throat. There were public punishments, applied for infractions as small as it takes sufficient water to pick up sufficient cotton. There was constant hunger, bare feet in the winter frosts, the diseases that spread through the overcrowded cabins. But there were also specific, targeted horrors that Samuel Blackwood reserved for those who somehow aroused their particular interest. In January 1855, Elijah, a 40-year-old man known for his strength, was whipped to pass out for questioning the quality of the seeds distributed for planting. In recovering consciousness, he was forced to work normally, with the open wounds exposed to the sun and dust. A week later, he died of infection. In March of the same year, Bessie, a 16-year-old, was sold after rejecting Charles's sexual onslaught, Blackwood's eldest son. The girl's mother, who begged her daughter not to be taken, spent 3 days stuck in the trunk without water or food. In August, 3 children were locked in the barn without food for 2 days, as punishment for being picked up rather than helping with the harvest. With each new horror, Sarah watched powerlessly, offering what she could: herbs to reduce pain, words of comfort, small gestures of humanity in an environment that systematically tried to destroy it. It observed the eyes of the victims change, the brightness of dignity decreasing, being replaced by a mixture of resignation and silent hatred. He saw this same process reflected in his own eyes as he looked on the surface of the well's water. Something was dying inside her. Something essential was being torn off, day after day, drops the drop. In the evening, lying on the wake of the straw that served by bed, Sarah felt the weight of the witnessed horrors, the images repeating in her mind like a nightmare from which she could not wake up. And at some point, between exhaustion and pain, something began to change. It was not a conscious decision, but a gradual transformation, such as water that drops the gout, wears the hardest stone. The compassion that always defined her began to give way to a cooler, more calculating feeling. The girl who knew plants to heal now learned to keep them for other purposes. The event that turned slow erosion into avalanche took place on a Sunday afternoon in mid-September 1857. Isaiah, Sarah's younger brother, was only 19 years old. He had been brought to Willowbrook 2 years earlier, bought by Blackwood at a Charleston auction specifically for his horsepower skills. A purchase he had made after Sarah mentioned during a boss's drop treatment, who had a brother with that talent. That Sunday, while preparing one of Blackwood's favorite horses for a walk, Isaiah made a mistake, dropped a brush that scared the animal. The horse stood up, almost knocking down Samuel Blackwood, which he was waiting for. The reaction was immediate. The Lord, already known for his violent temperament, ordered Isaiah to be tied to a tree in the center of the property, in the sight of all. The punishment began at noon and extended for hours. First came the whipped, applied by John Miller with meticulous cruelty, each scam calculated to cause maximum pain without risk of premature death. Then, when Isaiah's backs were no longer than a bloody mass of exposed flesh, Samuel Blackwood ordered salt to be rubbed in the open wounds. The youth's screams echoed through the plantation, a sound that seemed unreal, primordial, the sound expression of a pain beyond understanding. Sarah was prevented from intervening. Two women in the big house held her when she tried to run toward her brother, whispering that she would only make things worse, which would also be punished. Forced to watch from afar, Sarah felt something break inside her, not like a branch that departs under pressure, but like a long, release, free dike. When they finally allowed them to approach their brother, hours later, he barely breathed. Sarah carried him to his cabin, his arms shaking with the effort and the anger contained. He cleaned the wounds with warm water, applied herbal poultice, whispered words of comfort in his ear. For 3 days and 3 nights, he did not leave Isaiah's side, neglecting his tasks, risking punishments. At the dawn of the 4th day, he opened his eyes, stared at his sister's face and said with a weak voice, "Don't let them break you as they broke me." It was your last words. Sarah buried her brother in the small area next to the senzala reserved for the dead slaves. There was no formal ceremony, only the few minutes granted before everyone had to return to work. But that night alone, Sarah made her own ritual. It washed the body with water mixed with purifying herbs. He placed a small seed, symbol of Renaissance, on another earth. He cut a lock of his own hair and deposited her in Isaiah's hand before the rustic coffin was closed. And finally, kneeling over the newly criticized land, he took a silent oath, sealing with tears a promise that would forever change the course of his life. Willowbrook's raw reality was not about Samuel Blackwood. Oppression manifested itself through multiple agents, each contributing to their way to keep the human degradation machine functioning without interruption. Margaret Blackwood, the 45-year-old matriarch, hid behind her refined ways a particular cruelty directed at slaves who served in the big house. Her specialty was psychological humiliation. She forced women to undress completely for cleaning inspections, separated mothers from young children for days as punishment for minimal failures, spread rumors among slaves to cause internal conflicts. Charles Blackwood, the eldest son, 26, had developed a taste for sexual violence that was known throughout the plantation. Several young women had passed their hands, some pregnant, and then suffered mysterious miscarriages ordered by Margaret, who did not tolerate mulatto bastards on his property. The younger children, Thomas and William, 22 and 19 respectively, quickly learned from family examples, already showing worrying signs of sadism and contempt for the humanity of enslaved. John Miller, the overseer, a 38-year-old impoverished white man, compensated for his lower social position with extreme brutality. His whip was just one of the instruments in his torture arsenal. He also wore hot irons to mark troubled slaves, metal masks to prevent them from eating during work, heavy chains for those trying to escape. The local pastor, Reverend Matthews, visited the plantation monthly to perform religious services, preaching about the virtue of obedience and the sin of rebellion, sanctifying the system with carefully selected biblical passages. The event that served as the final catalyst occurred 3 months after Isaiah's death. Sarah had been called to the big house to deal with a fever that affected her 8-year-old daughter of the neighbors who were staying for Christmas. While preparing an infusion of herbs in the kitchen, he heard Charles Blackwood and his father talking in the adjacent room without realizing his presence. "I'm thinking of buying it," said Charles, the voice slightly altered by alcohol. "How much do you think is worth?" "The healer?" Samuel replied with a laugh. "She's been helpful, but she's getting rebellious since her brother died. Maybe it's good to pass her on before she contaminates others with her ideas." "It is not for the knowledge of herbs that I am interested," Charles laughed roughly. "I have other uses in mind. Have you noticed how she moves? There's a way of walking me." "Well, consider it an advanced gift of marriage," Samuel offered. "As soon as you and Catherine set your own home, Sarah can go with you. It will be a good test to see if you can tame that spirit." The world of Sarah, already reduced to so little, shrunk even more at that time. The glass he held slipped from his fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. The noise warned the men, who interrupted the conversation. Sarah quickly bent down to collect the shards, her heart hammering against her chest, the mind processing a new reality. It would be transferred to the direct control of Charles, a man whose healthy tendencies were known to everyone. That night, watching the stars through a crack on the roof of the cabin, Sarah learned that she had reached the point without return. The decision that had been forming since Isaiah's death crystallized in absolute certainty. It would not be broken. It would not be passed on as an object. Would not allow your body and spirit to be more violated than they had already been. If you couldn't escape the system, at least it would leave your mark on it, such a deep scar that no one in Willowbrook would never forget. A week after Christmas 1857, Sarah was publicly whipped for the first time in his 13 years in Willowbrook. The crime: drop and break a tray of English porcelain while serving tea to Margaret Blackwood and its visitors. Under normal circumstances, such an incident would result in a lower punishment, perhaps having the value of the object deducted from the already scarce feeds or a few days of additional work. But the Blackwood family seemed determined to break the healer's spirit before transferring it to Charles's new property. It was John Miller who applied the punishment, but Samuel Blackwood made a point of being present, observing with poorly disguised satisfaction. 20 whip, told aloud, applied to Sarah's already naked back, tied to the trunk of punishment in the center of the yard. Around, other slaves were forced to watch, a reminder of what happened to those who developed ideas above their condition. The pain was indescribable. Each blow seemed to tear not only the skin, but something deeper, something essential. Sarah bit her lips until she was bleeding so as not to scream, refusing to give this satisfaction to the Blackwood. In his mind, he repeated as a mantra the names of all he had lost. His mother, sold when Sarah was only 6 years old. His father, dead with exhaustion in the fields. His grandmother, who had taught him about herbs. And finally, Isaiah, her brother, the last person in the world who connected her to a family idea. When they finally released her, Sarah could barely stand up. Martha, an older woman who served in the big house's kitchen, helped her go back to the cabin. While cleaning the wounds, Martha whispered, "They are trying to prepare you for Charles. That's how he likes his women. Broken. Docile." Sarah did not answer, but her eyes, once bright and expressive, were now different, opaque on the surface, but with something dangerous shining in the depths. In the following weeks, Sarah presented outwardly all signs of a subjugated person. He kept his head down, spoke only when directly questioned, performed his tasks with a silent efficiency. The Blackwood noticed the change and interpreted it as submission. "It saw," Samuel commented with his son during dinner. "It's just a matter of showing who rules. Even the most obstinate eventually learn." What they didn't realize was that behind that subservience mask, Sarah was more alert than ever. It meticulously observed the routines of the big house, the habits of each family member, the moments when they were alone, the drinks and food they preferred. He noticed which slaves showed signs of silent resistance, which one had been completely broken, which could be reliable. And in the scarce hours he had for himself, between the sunset and the touch of collecting, he was harvested and prepared certain plants that grew in the marshy areas beyond the cotton fields. Sarah's internal transformation was invisible to her oppressors, but noticeable to some of her captivity companions. Martha, who had helped her after the whipping, noticed how the healer's movements, once fluid and almost graceful even in performing the most arduous tasks, were now accurate, economical, calculated. He also noticed how Sarah had begun to store small portions of her already insufficient food, as she had begun to exchange healing services for specific favors with other slaves. A piece of rope here, a small pocket knife there, information about when the horses would be fed or when the pantry would be unfolded. The definitive turning point occurred on a damp night of February 1858. Sarah was called to the big house to deal with a migraine that plagued Margaret Blackwood. While preparing an infusion of herbs in the ladies' room, Charles entered warning. Margaret had dormant under the effect of soothing herbs, and the eldest son of the house took the opportunity to corner Sarah against the wall, pressing his body against hers. "Soon, you will be mine," he whispered, his hot breath and alcohol loaded against her face. "Dad said I can take her as soon as I get married next month. I look forward to teaching you your new place." Her hand slid through Sarah's waist, climbing her breast over the simple cotton dress. With his other hand, he held her face, forcing her to look into his eyes. "You will be my private dog. You will give me strong children, and if you do not serve to work, You will be sold for good money." Sarah remained immovable. Her face is an inexpressive mask, but inside, something solidified a final, irrevocable decision. That night, back to the cabin, he took the small bag of fabric containing his inherited treasures under the floor. He added to him a new collection: carefully dry seeds and roots, thin, powdered leaves, small bags containing specific mixtures. Then, kneeling on the dirt floor beaten, in the trembling light of a small oil lamp that had achieved through Martha, began to plan. 3 weeks later, at dawn, Sarah woke up even before the bell of awakening. He dressed in the darkness, took his little bag of treasures and silently came out of the cabin. The sky was still black, sprinkled with stars, when it began to move events that would forever change the story of Willowbrook. In the months that followed the death of Isaiah, Sarah had become a respected healer into a meticulous strategist. The plan he had elaborated was not the result of a momentary impulse, but of a long observation of the patterns and weaknesses of the system that imprisoned it. As a chess player who anticipates various movements, she identified potential allies, escape routes, necessary resources, and, more importantly, the exact moment to act. His network of collaborators grew organically, united people not by an explicit rebellion strategy, too dangerous to be openly articulated, but by small acts of resistance and solidarity. Martha, the 53-year-old cook, whose fragile appearance hid an unshakable inner force, provided information about the routines of the big house and access to the pantry. Daniel, a 22-year-old man who took care of the stables, a guarantee that certain horses would be available on the planned night. Ezekiel, an older man who, due to his apparent docility, was allowed to circulate the property as a messenger, served as a communication link between the various accomplices. Property mapping was done during months of careful observation. Sarah memorized the hours of the night rounds, identified the blind spots in surveillance, timed how long he took to go from one point to another without being detected. He studied the Blackwood family's sleep habits, noting that Samuel had a cup of wine before bed and that Charles often was drunk from his town visits, falling into deep sleep around midnight. The resources were discreetly gathered, a pocket knife exchanged for a remedy, thin strings diverted from those that would be used to tie cotton bales, a small amount of flammable oil extracted from the lamps, specific herbs collected in marshy areas beyond the cultivated lands. Sarah also prepared journey medications, mixtures to treat wounds, fight fever, relieve pain. And more importantly, it elaborated less benign substances, a powder that, mixed with drinks, caused deep sleep, a paste that, in contact with the skin, caused painful blisters, an ointment that, applied to blades, even made potentially fatal surface cuts. The chosen date was not accidental. March 15th, 1858, the eve of Charles Blackwood's wedding with Catherine Holloway, daughter of another landowner in the region. The property would be in preparations for the celebration, creating an environment of relative disorder that could mask unusual movements. In addition, many guests would be coming, increasing the number of available carriages and horses, facilitating both the execution of the plan and the subsequent escape. The night before the action, Sarah gathered briefly with her 5 main collaborators in a small branch behind the stables. Under the starry sky, she designated specific functions. Martha would ensure that the food served at the supper contained Sarah's prepared sleepwalk. Daniel would guarantee that 3 horses would be sealed and ready in the farthest stable. Ezekiel would watch over the movements of the night watchman. Ruth, an 18-year-old girl who worked as a storage, would distract anyone who could intercept them. And Jacob, UM30-year-old strongman, would be responsible for neutralizing the overseer if he noticed something suspicious. "We are not killers," Sarah explained in a low voice, while the others formed a tight circle around him. "We will not be like them. Our goal is freedom, not revenge." It was a half-truth. The group really sought freedom, but Sarah kept an additional purpose to her, a reckoning with Samuel Blackwood that she would perform alone, without involving others in an act that could be punished with death. Before they separate, each received a small bag containing medicinal herbs, a little dry food, and some coins obtained over months through small services secretly rendered to free workers. "Tomorrow at midnight," Sarah concluded. "When they hear the gavillon scream 3 times, They will know it's time to act. The group dispersed quickly, each one returning to their accommodation by different paths, carrying a volatile mixture of fear and hope in the chest. Alone again, Sarah knelt on the damp land and under the silver light of the moon, whispered a prayer, not to the deities of the whites, but to the ancestral spirits that her grandmother had taught her to respect. He asked for strength, clarity of thought, and above all justice, regardless of the personal cost he had to pay for it. The morning of March 15th, 1858, dawned with an unusual excitement in Willowbrook. Carriages arrived, bringing the first guests to the wedding that would happen the next day. Created free, hired especially for the occasion, they ran from side to side carrying chests, organizing flowers, polishing silly. In the midst of this confusion, plantation slaves performed their regular tasks as well as additional services required by party preparations. In the big house, Margaret Blackwood supervised the last details of the decoration, shouting orders and criticism. Samuel received the most important guests in the office, where whiskey glasses were served while discussing politics and businesses. Charles spent the day between visits to the city to seek his wedding costume and drinks with friends who arrived for the celebration. Meanwhile, at the back of the property, far from the eyes of whites occupied with the preparations, a silent choreography developed. Sarah, appearing the same submission of the last months, moved between her regular tasks and small strategic deviations. He briefly visited the barn to hide a package containing clean clothes and provisions. He passed the outer kitchen, where Martha worked in the preparations of the festive dinner, and slid discreetly a small bag of dust for the hand of the old cook. He met, accidentally, with Daniel near the stable, confirming with an almost imperceptible look that the horses would be ready. In the afternoon, as it harvested medicinal herbs in the fringes of the forest that delimited the property, a special permission granted due to its healer function, Sarah ended her own preparation. From a hiding place between roots of an old oak, he removed an object that had secretly adapted over weeks, a broomstick. It was not a common broom, but one that she herself had changed, sanding one end until she formed a sharp tip, almost like a rudimentary spear. The object had a double meaning: working instrument associated with the servile condition, transformed into a weapon of liberation. Sarah wrapped him into fabric, tied him on his back under his wide clothes, and returned to the plantation. As the sun was beginning to put, two parallel realities coexisted in Willowbrook. In the big house and in the gardens illuminated by torches, the whites celebrated with music, laughter, and abundance of food and drink. In the dark housing of the slaves, a silent tension grew, not just among the conspirators, but in all who, even without knowing the details, felt instinctively that something different was about to happen. The wedding eve dinner extended late. The servants, including various plantation slaves, served dishes elaborated to a table full of influential guests. Samuel Blackwood, in the center of the table, proudly narrated the expansion plans of his land after his son's union with the Holloway family. Margaret smiled rigidly, keeping the perfect hostess appearances. Charles, already visibly drunk, made indiscreet comments about his bride and plans for the wedding night that ripped rude laughter from men and uncomfortable looks of the women present. In the back, in the outer kitchen, Martha discreetly added Sarah's powder to the sauce that would follow the dessert, just enough to induce drowsiness, not to arouse suspected poisoning. The slaves who served the table had instructions to ensure that all family members Blackwood and the Maine forever received generous portions of that specific dish. As the night was advancing, the party in the big house gradually transformed. The music was higher, the most uninhibited conversations, the slower movements. Around 11 o'clock, several guests had already taken the rooms prepared for them. Samuel Blackwood, contrary to his habit of moderating alcohol consumption, was carried away on the special occasion and emptied several cups of brandy. Charles, completely drunk, was practically charged to his room by two friends in little better conditions. Margaret, exhausted from preparations and annoyed by his son's behavior, withdrew earlier, taking a dose of the sleeping medicine that Sarah had prepared, unknowingly, that night concentration was significantly stronger than usual. In the senzala, the conspirators were waiting, each in their cabin, each with their fear and their hope. Sarah, lying in her treadmill but completely awakened, told the minutes, calculating the time needed for the drug in the sauce to take effect, so that the night watchman would complete their round, so that the property plunged into the silence preceding the dawn. At midnight, Sarah got up silently. He put on an extra shirt under his simple dress, protection against the cold of the night, and padding for what would come. He withdrew from his hiding place under the floor the small bag containing his herbs mixtures. He checked the modified broomstick, testing his firmness. Then he went out to the night, moving like a shadow between the cabins. First, he went to the agreed place near the farthest stable. There he issued the sound of a hawk 3 times, a sign to the others that the plan was underway. Then, as their accomplices performed their designated parts, Martha checking if everyone in the house was really sleeping, Daniel preparing the horses, the others creating strategic distractions or neutralizing possible obstacles. Sarah headed for the big house. Using a rarely watched path, which he had discovered in his meticulous observations, he approached the entrance to the back. The usually locked door had been left ajar by Ruth, as agreed. Sarah slid in, her bare feet not producing any sound on the wooden floor. The house was silent, except for the occasional snore coming from the rooms where guests slept, many still dressed, overcome by the combination of alcohol and sedative in the sauce. Accurately, who knew every ranging board, every illuminated corridor, Sarah climbed the service ladder to the 2nd floor. He passed Margaret's room, checking through the ajar door that you slept deeply. He also checked the room where Charles had been deposited. The young man was spread to bed, still completely dressed, in so deep sleep that he looked more like a coma. Finally, he arrived at the main room, that of Samuel Blackwood. He stopped before the massive door of Carvalho, took a deep breath, and for the first time that night allowed himself to feel the weight of what he was about to do. It was not just his freedom that was at stake, not just revenge for his brother's death. It was something bigger, deeper, a reckoning with a system that had stolen his humanity piece by piece year after year. With a calm that would surprise any observer, Sarah turned the doorknob and entered the room of the man who 13 years ago controlled every aspect of his existence. The room was weakly lit by a single candle that slowly consumed on the bedside table. Samuel Blackwood slept on his stomach, snoring slightly, the sheet covering only part of his robust body, dressed only with a sleeping nightgown. The window was open, letting in the fresh spring night breeze, making the apricot curtains swing gently. Sarah closed the door behind her without noise. For a moment he only observed the sleeping man, the partially visible face relaxed by sleep and alcohol, looking almost harmless. It was difficult to reconcile that image with that of the tyrant who had ordered his brother's flogging to death, who had negotiated his transfer to Charles's hands as a commodity, who had destroyed lives without a second thought. With deliberate movements, Sarah removed from her robes the modified broom. The sharp tip briefly glowed in the candlelight as it approached the bed. There was no hesitation in his footsteps. There was no tremor in his hands. The decision had been made long before that moment, consolidated by months of planning, fueled by years of suffering. Sarah positioned himself beside the bed, and with a quick and accurate movement, pulled the sheet, completely exposing Samuel's body. The man shifted igely but did not wake up, effect of the combination of alcohol consumed at the party and sedative on dessert sauce. With the same precision calculated, Sarah tore the back of the Lord's nightgown, exposing his buttocks. What followed was executed with a surgical coldness that contrasted with the violence of the act. Sarah positioned the sharp tip of the broomstick and, with a single strong and determined movement, pushed it, penetrating Samuel Blackwood's body deeply and irreversibly. The cry that broke out of the throat of the lord of the plantation was acute and animalistic, a primordial sound of pain and surprise that pierced the silence of the night. Samuel tried to turn around, reaching what he hurts him, but Sarah kept the cable firmly in place, twisting him slightly to amplify agony. "This is for Isaiah," she whispered, leaning out so that her face was close to his. "And for all the others you broke." Samuel's eyes, now completely awake, widened in recognition and horror to see who his aggressor was. He tried to scream again, but Sarah, predicting it, quickly stuck a piece of fabric that he had prepared. I didn't want the screams to attract attention prematurely, not before I could conclude what they had been doing. "For 13 years, you have every part of my body and my life," she continued, the low but perfectly audible voice in the silence of the room. interrupted only by the muffled moans of pain. Today I recover my humanity, taking a piece of yours. With a final movement, Sarah pushed the cable even deeper, ensuring that the damage would be permanent, even if not fatal. I wanted Samuel Blackwood to live to carry the physical and psychological mark of what she had done, live to face the humiliation of explaining how she had been attacked and mutilated by a slave, to live to fear others to follow her example. When finally pulled the cable, a significant amount of blood began to flow from the wound. Sarah knew, by her knowledge of anatomy, that she had hit deep tissues, but avoided main arteries. The man would survive, but it would never be the same. He would never sit comfortably again, never exert power without remembering the pain and humiliation of that night. Now you understand, she said, watching Samuel's outlined face. What does it mean to have your body violated, your dignity destroyed? The difference is that you did it with us every day, in 1,000 different ways. Samuel's eyes, injected with pain and hatred, fixed on hers. For a moment, it was as if the roles of lord and slave had completely reversed. Now he was defenseless, pleading, at the mercy of another human being who had total power over his destiny. Sarah methodically cleaned the cable on a piece of torn sheet, wrapped it back on the protective fabric and tied it to her back under her clothes. It would not leave behind the evidence that would connect it directly to the crime. He then leaned one last time over the man who had been his owner and lord. I didn't come here to kill you, she whispered. I came to mark you just as you marked so many of us, so that every time you feel pain, remember our pains. Each time you feel humiliated, remember our humiliations. Sarah then headed at the door, but before leaving, she turned to one last look. Samuel Blackwood, the mighty Lord of Willowbrook, lay in his own bed, bleeding, gagged, wide eyes with pain and unbelief. The image was the perfect reverse of so many scenes that Sarah had witnessed over the years. Slaves whipped on the trunk, women violated in the cabins, men broken by excessive work in the fields. The poetic justice of the moment did not escape him. With the same calm with which he had entered, Sarah left the room, gently closing the door behind him. He knew it wouldn't take long for Samuel's screams, as soon as he could remove the gag, alert the whole house. It was only minutes to reach the stable where Daniel waited with the horses, where the other 4 conspirators should already be gathered, ready for the planned escape. He quickly descended the service ladder, crossed the kitchen, and left the back door. The night was clear, illuminated by an almost full moon that bathed the property in silver light. Sarah ran, no longer worrying about hiding. Now it was a race against time, against the shouts that would soon echo, against persecutors who would soon set up their horses. Upon reaching the designated stable, he found the other 5 as planned. Daniel had prepared 3 horses, not the best of property which would certainly be sought first, but resistant animals that could carry 2 people each over long distances. Martha had a small bag containing bread, carne dry, and some diverted fruits from the kitchen. Jacob had achieved an old shotgun and some ammunition, borrowed from one of the least watched deposits. Is it done? Martha asked, her eyes fixed on Sarah's face. It's done, confirmed Sarah, without going into detail. We have to go now. The screams will start at any time. As if in response to his words, a distant fuss began to sound from the big house. Lights began to turn on the windows, confusing voices called each other, doors beat. North, said Sarah, riding one of the horses, helping Martha climb behind her. We go to the north as we planned. We separated at dawn. The 3 horses came out of the stable, driving not to the main road, but to a secondary path that Sarah had identified in her planning months, a less used route that led to the dense forest that marked the northern limit of the property. Behind them, the chaos settled in Willowbrook, a confusion of shouts, contradictory orders, and the sound of weapons being prepared. At the front of the small group of fugitives, riding under the moonlight that silvered the cotton fields, Sarah felt something she had not experienced since childhood, the feeling of fresh air entering free lungs, the wind on her face without the weight of submission, the open possibility of a tomorrow determined by her own choices. He carried with him the horror of what he had done, yes, but also the certainty that that act of calculated violence had been the necessary culmination of a much larger systemic violence that had shaped his entire existence. While the horse's hooves devoured the distance between her and her past, Sarah Johnson turned no longer just a fugitive slave, not just a skilled healer, but a living symbol of resistance that would soon be known far beyond the limits of Willowbrook. At dawn, as planned, the group separated. Daniel and Ruth went to the west toward a free black community on which they had heard rumors. Jacob and Ezekiel continued to the north, with the intention of reaching the states where slavery had been abolished. Sarah and Martha, the two women who had conceived the nucleus of the plan, chose the risky path. They went to the east to the coastal swamps where fugitive slaves had established hidden settlements. The news of what had happened in Willowbrook spread quickly. At first they were just whispered rumors among slaves in neighboring plantations. A healer had attacked his lord, leaving him alive but hopelessly injured, and then fled with 5 others. The details of the attack were initially vacant, but over the days, the full story emerged through reports of free employees who had witnessed subsequent chaos on the Blackwood property. Samuel had been found by Margaret, alerted by her husband's screams after being able to remove the gag. The doctor had been immediately called, but even after stunning the bleeding, the prognosis was dark. The inner wound was deep, the infection practically inevitable, and even if he survived, Samuel Blackwood would never walk normally or sit without extreme pain. Humiliation was as severe as the physical injury. The proud lord of slaves, subdued and violated by one of his properties, a woman who everyone believed to have been tamed after public whipping. Charles's marriage was postponed indefinitely. The Holloway family, concerned about the social implications of associating the Blackwood after such an incident, was discreetly withdrew to his property, taking the bride with tears. Charles, consumed by anger and shame, personally organized a search force, swearing to bring Sarah back alive so that he could be executed publicly. Local authorities, alarmed with the boldness of the attack and fearing it could inspire other acts of rebellion, mobilized significant resources for the capture of fugitives. Official reports were sent to neighboring counties describing the 6 slaves, with a special emphasis on Sarah, identified as the leader and direct perpetrator of the Samuel attack. Substantial rewards were offered, $500 by Sarah, $200 for each other. The most disturbing for the community of slave owners, however, was the reaction among the enslaved. Despite attempts to suppress the story or present it as an act of wild barbarism, the narrative that circulated in the senzalas was very different. Sarah became quickly a legendary figure, the healer who had used her knowledge not only to alleviate suffering, but to inflict justice, the woman who had transformed a symbol of servitude, the broom, into an instrument of retribution. Even more alarming, in the weeks that followed, relatos of similar attacks began to emerge in neighboring plantations. In some cases, they were just rumors or veiled threats that kept told gentlemen at night, looking at their doors suspiciously. In others, they were real incidents. A worker known for their cruelty found unconscious after being struck in the head. A gentleman accused of abusing young slaves who woke up with his greased intimate parts with a prepared that caused painful inflammation. A particularly cruel lady who developed a mysterious allergy after consuming a tea prepared by her personal slave. None of these subsequent incidents had the severity of Sarah's attack, but together they formed a pattern that local authorities soon called the Johnson Method. A form of inspired resistance not on the escape or open rebellion, but in calculated retribution, in the momentary reversal of power relations, in the exploration of oppressive vulnerabilities. The panic between the owners' class contrasted with the underground current of hope that traveled the enslaved communities. Stories about Sarah were transmitted into whispers, growing and turning with each new narrator. Some said she had magical powers learned from her African grandmother, who could become invisible at ease, who had bewitched Samuel Blackwood before attacking him. Others claimed that she now led an army of fugitive slaves in the marshy areas, planning new attacks. The work songs gained new ciphered verses that celebrated their courage, turning it into a possible resistance symbol. For the authorities and slave owners, Sarah Johnson's capture has become not only a matter of justice, but of urgent need to restore order and submission. A woman who had so dramatically challenged the system represented an existential threat that could not be tolerated. The search intensified, expanding beyond the limits of the county, involving professional slave hunters with their trained dogs, local militias, and even some regular military units. 3 months after the escape, Daniel and Ruth were captured as they tried to cross the Ohio River. Submitted to brutal interrogations, provided contradictory information about Sarah's whereabouts, a deliberate tactic that had combined during the escape planning. Daniel was publicly executed as an example. Ruth, pregnant, was returned to Willowbrook to work on kitchens under constant surveillance. Jacob and Ezekiel were able to reach Canada, where years later, they would provide detailed accounts of the abolitionist who documented the atrocities of slavery. His testimonies, initially published anonymously, would contribute to strengthen the anti-slavagist movement in the North. As for Sarah and Martha, her initial destination remained a mystery to the persecutors. The two women had been able to reach coastal swamps and found refuge in one of the hidden quilombs established by previous generations of fugitives. There, Sarah's skills as healer guaranteed her immediate acceptance, while her knowledge of local plants expanded considerably to contact with other medicinal traditions preserved by the community. For almost a year, they lived in relative security, protected by the hostile geography of the swamp and the solidarity network among similar communities. Sarah established a new routine, treating patients, teaching her knowledge to younger apprentices, participating in the collective decisions that ruled life in the settlement. For the first time since childhood, I experienced something close to peace. Not a complete happiness because Willowbrook's scars were too deep to fully heal, but a dignified, self-determined existence. The persecution, however, had not ceased. In July 1859, more than a year after the attack on Samuel Blackwood, who had survived, but remained invalid and prisoner, the approximate location of the Quilombo was revealed by a slave captured during an attempt to escape a neighboring plantation. A force composed of local militiamen and professional slave hunters organized a coordinated attack surrounding the settlement before dawn. The alarm sounded when the first hunting dogs were heard, followed by shots that tore the silence of the dawn. The Quilombo inhabitants, about 40 people between men, women, and children, implemented their emergency plan. Some forming a line of defense to slow attackers, others guiding the most vulnerable by pre-established escape routes that only those who knew the swamp could navigate. Sarah and Martha were among those who remained to defend the withdrawal. Armed with old rifles and superior knowledge of the terrain, managed to ambush one of the groups of strikers, gaining precious time so that children and the elderly could escape. When the ammunition was over, they retreated deeper into the swamp where the horses of the persecutors could not follow. For 3 days, the group led by Sarah, now reduced to 12 people, has constantly moved, using submerged trails, hiding their tracks, taking advantage of areas that dogs could not sniff due to the strong natural odors of the swamp. On the 4th day, however, they were trapped in an elevated area, a small island in the midfield, surrounded by shallow but easily passable waters by the persecutors who had now located them. "You go ahead," Sarah told her companions as they spotted the stalkers' torches approaching dusk. "I delay them." Martha, now almost 55, refused to leave her. "We started together, we finished together," he said, checking the knife he carried, his last weapon after the end of the ammunition. The other 10, after a brief hesitation, followed the alternative escape plan, a longer and more dangerous route through an area known for housing alligators, but which offered a chance to escape as the pursuers focused on Sarah and Martha. The two women prepared their defensive position in the only easy access point for the small island. Sarah used her knowledge of plants to quickly prepare mixtures that, when thrown into the fire, produced dense and disorienting smoke. Martha posted partially submerged pointed stakes in shallow water, creating traps for those who tried to hurry. When the first strikers arrived, they were greeted by a combination of blinding smoke and hidden stakes that caused confusion and injury. For a few hours, the two women managed to keep the persecutors at a distance, but as night was advanced and more men arrived, it was clear that it was just a matter of time. The siege tightened with the sunrise. 17 armed men, led by Charles Blackwood, who in the months since the attack on his father had become even more cruel and obsessed with Sarah's capture, positioned themselves around the island. They offered surrender in exchange for saved life, a promise that both Sarah and Martha knew to be false. "I will never be property again," Sarah replied aloud, that everyone would hear. neither in life nor in death. The final attack began at noon. The men advanced simultaneously on all sides, willing to accept casualties to ensure that neither escapes. Sarah and Martha, positioned back against back in the center of the small island, fought with the fury of those who have accepted the final destination, but refused to make it easy for the enemy. Martha fell first, hit by a shot that picked her into her shoulder, followed by another on her chest. Sarah, seeing her friend fall, abandoned any defensive caution and advanced against the attackers, the knife in one hand, a handful of caustic powder prepared with herbs in the other. He managed to severely injure 2 men before multiple shots hit her. Even fallen, bleeding for wounds that he knew to be fatal, Sarah kept her eyes fixed on Charles Blackwood, which approached cautiously, the rifle pointed at her. "You can kill me," she said, the weak but perfectly audible voice in the silence that followed the shots. "But what I did with your father will live forever in memory. Each time a slave looks at his lord, he will think of what is possible. Each time a gentleman looks at his slaves, he will fear what can happen." Charles came closer, the face containing face of hatred, and something more, perhaps fear, perhaps reluctant recognition of the truth in her words. "Your father is alive," continued Sarah, the blood dripping through the corner of his mouth, "but every day wants to be dead. Humiliation consumes him more than the pain. And you know what is more terrible for him? Knowing that I decided to spare him, that his life continued because I chose so." Sarah Johnson's last words, later recorded by one of the slave hunters present and included in the official report on his death, were, "I'm not just one person. I am all those you tried to break and failed. And there will be others after me, many others." Charles Blackwood threw at close range, ending the life of the woman who had turned her family and unknowingly established her own place in the history of resistance to slavery. The bodies of Sarah and Martha were brought back to Willowbrook and displayed publicly in the central yard as warning. Samuel Blackwood, dragging on with difficulty supported by canes, made a point of spitting on the corpses before they were buried in unmarked ditches within the limits of the property. Local authorities declared the case closed. The newspapers briefly reported the capture and death of the criminal slave responsible for the attack on our speaking owner of land, and official life followed its course. But Sarah Johnson's physical death did not mean the end of her influence. On the contrary, its execution only solidified its transformation from person to symbol. In the senzalas across the region, stories about it continued to circulate, evolving with each narration. For some, she had been a powerful witch who before she died had cast a curse over all slave owners. For others, it was the manifestation of ancestral justice, sent by African spirits to avenge generations of suffering. For others, it was simply a brave woman who had shown that oppressors were not invulnerable. Objects associated with Sarah, or claimed to have been hers, acquired almost mystical status. A small herb bag found in its cabin was divided among several women of the senzala, each fragment stored as a protective talisman. A red scarf she used to wear on her hair, recovered by one of the cooks before her possessions were burned, was torn into strips that circulated as secret symbols of resistance. Even the broomstick, not the true instrument of its revenge, which had been destroyed, but similar ones, gained symbolic meaning, small discrete marks being made in them, as a silent memory of what a determined person could realize. Work songs incorporated references coded into their history. Apparently innocent with lyrics about healing, plants, and liberation, these songs allowed Sarah's memory to be preserved and transmitted without alerting the overseers who listened to them, without understanding their deeper meaning. The healing herb can also burn. The cable that sweeps can also pierce. When the night is darker, the light of truth will shine. The stories about Sarah crossed borders of states, becoming as they traveled. In some versions, she had managed to escape the final siege and lived free in the north, continuing to help runaway slaves. In others, his spirit remained in the swamps, guiding fugitives to security and pursuing persecutors. In even others, she had only been the first of many women who would adopt her method of resistance, forming a secret brotherhood dedicated to punishing particularly cruel gentlemen. In the years following his death, small pilgrimages began to occur. Slaves who were allowed to visit relatives in neighboring plantations made deviations to pass the approximate place where Sarah and Martha had made their last resistance. There, discreetly, they left small offerings, a flower, a stone, a rope knot, and whispered prayers or promises. The place, an insignificant island in the midfielder, became an unofficial sanctuary, a point of connection with the spirit of resistance that Sarah had incarnated. Samuel Blackwood never completely recovered, neither physically nor psychologically. The wound infected repeatedly, requiring multiple painful medical interventions. More devastating than constant pain, however, was humiliation. Unable to ride on horseback, to sit comfortably for more than a few minutes, devised of opium to support chronic discomfort, he was gradually isolating himself. The whispers and eyes of the neighbors and known became unbearable. Everyone knew what had happened, although the exact nature of the wound was mentioned only in private conversations, with a mixture of horror and secret delight by the appropriate destiny of the notorious tyrant. The Blackwood family declined. Charles, consumed by alcoholism and a growing paranoia towards the property slaves, has become an erratic and violent administrator. Several slaves died under their impulsive punishments, reducing the available workforce. The bride abandoned him definitely, marrying a New Orleans trader. Margaret, bound by her husband's fate and self-destructive behavior, withdrew to her sister's house in Richmond, taking most of the family's jewelry and values. Willowbrook, once one of the most prosperous properties in the region, came into economic collapse during the Civil War. When emancipation finally arrived, the big house was already partially abandoned, the poorly cared for the dilapidated fortune. Charles died in 1871, alone and drunk, drowning in a shallow stream after falling from his horse. The property was sold by a fraction of its original value to pay accumulated debts. Decades later, when academic studies on slave resistance began to gain legitimacy, Sarah Johnson's story emerged from oral reports to written records. Historians debated the truth of the details, the extent of their influence, the motivations behind their actions. OFI documents. CI of the Time police reports, property records, correspondence between local authorities provided only the narrative skeleton, while oral tradition, preserved mainly by descendants of slaves in the region, gave him flesh, blood, and spirit. Some academics argued that Sarah represented an isolated case of individual resistance, without greater historical significance beyond her brutality. Others saw in it the perfect example of how systemic oppression eventually generated equally systemic forms of resistance. It was debated if their acts had been justifiable, if they represented an aberration or a natural response to the inhuman conditions of slavery, if they should be celebrated or lamented. While academic debates continued in classrooms and specialized publications, Sarah's popular memory remained alive in more visceral and direct ways. Their stories were told in the kitchens and balconies, transmitted from grandparents to grandchildren, preserved in local variations that kept the essence of their message. Human dignity, once awakened, finds ways to express themselves even in the most adverse circumstances. The court, even if postponed, eventually assumes forms that powerful cannot predict or control. In the small town that emerged decades later near the former Willowbrook, a curious ritual developed among some of the oldest families. On the first night of the spring full moon, a red tape-decorated broom was discreetly placed at the door of a house where there was domestic violence or abuse. No one admitted to being responsible for this act, but the message was clear. The community was vigilant, Sarah's memory persisted, and certain actions would not be tolerated indefinitely. Willowbrook's ruins, gradually claimed by vegetation, became a place avoided by local residents, especially after dusk. It was said that on March nights, near the date of the original attack, it was possible to hear the echo of male shouts from the rubble of the big house, followed by the sound of female steps downstairs that had long disappeared. Some swore to have seen the figure of a black woman of erect size, a red handkerchief in her hair, walking between the ruins with a broomstick in her hand, her face simultaneously serene and determined, her eyes reflecting the deep knowledge of those who saw the worst of humanity, and yet chose to act according to their own terms. Truth or legend, history or myth. Sarah Johnson's narrative remains an uncomfortable reminder that oppression systems, however consolidated, always contain the seeds of their own vulnerability, that the power exerted without justice eventually finds resistance in the least anticipated forms and places. May humanity denied its rights, sometimes through acts that challenge simple categories of right and wrong, and that in the end, it is the stories of ordinary people transformed by extraordinary circumstances that survive the test of time, echoing through generations as a persistent whisper. To resist is to exist. If you watched so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Sarah's story touched her heart. Share so that Sarah's memory is never forgotten.